to another video. We are going to work on something that was actually requested today. So earlier this week I posted a picture on my Instagram, and then I shared it into a couple of Facebook groups, and it was of some stamps that I had actually added a little bit of colored pencil shading to just add a little depth to them. So many people were requesting a coloring tutorial that I thought, hey, you know, I can do that in my live and show you guys how to do this with the colored pencils. So just a little background, I actually started card making in 2010, and most of the cards that I was doing at that time were line art style cards or stamps that I was using, and they needed color added to them. Well, at the time, I couldn't afford all of the really cool mediums that everybody was using to color in their images. So I had to use colored pencils that I got from the cheapy department store. So I had really inexpensive pencils that I was working with. Well, the one thing with inexpensive pencils is they still work, but you have to put a lot more technique into them to make them look as good as some of the more expensive different types of mediums. So I spent a lot of time learning how to use these and learning how to color them. And then as I got better quality products to use, I already had that technique in place. So the pencils just, you know, the better pencils made it easier for me to do what I was doing already with the other pencils. So we're going to start today, and I'm going to do a little bit of explaining about coloring and kind of some theory and some whys with how things work before I get into the actual coloring with it. I don't know that I'm going to color the full image just because of time constraints doing a live. However, I will show you enough that you guys are going to be perfectly capable of getting started on your own. And I do want to say, one of the big things with coloring is that the best and biggest thing that you can do to make your coloring better is practice. Practice, practice, practice a lot. I've had 8 years of experience coloring images so that makes a difference in how my coloring looks compared to someone who started coloring even just a year ago with it. If you have an art background, it's a lot easier too. But just lots and lots of practice is the best thing that you can do to help your coloring. So I'm going to go ahead and get everything flipped around, and we're going to go ahead and start talking about this. Hang on just one moment. Okay, I see now. Okay, so talking about the 48 pencils that are in here. And the reason I was talking about these is because our pencils are a wax base. So the pigment is carried in a wax base with it, which means that you get a nice coverage with just a very light touch, because that wax is going to lay down on the paper and going to put that pigment down on the paper. It also makes your blending so much easier with it because the wax kind of works with each other to get in there. Now, so one bad thing with that is that if you put a lot of pressure down on the pencil, yes, you get a lot of pigment right there, right at the get-go. However, you have a hard time layering color and blending color when you're doing this, because what happens is, I'm not sure if that's going to pick up, I can see it on mine, but it starts to get that shiny surface to it. That's called a wax bloom. And what happens at that point is it basically means the paper is just saturated with that wax. So it's no longer able to take any more pigment in those areas. So what you're going to wind up with happening at that point is you're going to wind up having streaky or patchy color as you're trying to blend over the top of that. So you always want to be using a really light touch. Now, another reason for the light touch is because of our paper. So this is our whipped cream cardstock, and this is a very smooth cardstock. So there's not a lot of texture to it to actually pick up the pigment. So to explain that better, and take this brush. So what happens when you lay color down is your pencil glides across the fibers of the paper and it catches that color and that pigment in between the fibers, and it starts to fill in the wells or the valleys with color. So as you drag your pencil along, that fiber that's sticking up is what's actually helping you lay pigment down. So if you press hard and you press those fibers down, your well or your valley is not going to take as much color with it because there's less depth to it. So when you're working on a very smooth cardstock, you already have a smaller well that you're dealing with this. So I often recommend, if you're doing a line art style image, to stamp on the color splash sheets. They have a lot more texture to them. So if you're going to be doing a lot of color on top of it, those actually pick up really, really well. But doing stuff on the whipped cream is possible. You just have to have a very light touch as you're doing it. So the last thing I wanted to talk about before we got into the coloring itself is light. So when you're coloring, you need to decide where your light source is going to come from as you are coloring on your images. So for instance, with this pumpkin, right now it's fairly evenly toned. There's a couple little spots where you can see the color variation, which is actually color variation that's painted on there. But if I take one of my lights, I have two lights that are on either side of the mat here. If I turn one of my lights off, now you see a lot more shading and a lot more shadow that's going into the pumpkin. So you can see that where the ribs are elevated and then go back down in, there's a shadow where that rib has dipped back in. So, and it gets a little bit more here and a little bit darker here as you go. That's because these ribs are in the way. So there's a shadow that's falling based on the direction of the light. So the light's coming from right up here. Based on the direction of the light is where the shadow falls. So that makes a difference in your coloring. When you're coloring something, you have to take into account that an item is 3D. There's volume and there's something in the way blocking that light. So we're going to be working on a fox today when we're coloring, but I wanted to show you with a pencil that you can actually see what happens with the shading on this. So you have the head up here. First off, you have this ear, and let's say we're going to color with the light coming in at an angle just like this. Okay, so this ear is slightly blocking right there for shadow. This head is round, so you're going to have a little bit of shading on the outside edges, but you're also going to have a lot of shading down here underneath the jawline where that round head is blocking the light that's coming in. So here, of course, this is all being blocked off by this leg. Here, this is being slightly blocked by the body that's in front of it. You're going to have some shadow here because the tail is round. It's not a straight flat surface. So you're going to have some shadow that's going to come up here. Even where it curls around, you're going to have a little bit of shadow right up there. Again, on the tail back here, the body is blocking this portion of it. So you're going to have shadow there. And you're going to have shadow down along the back side of it because your light's coming from here. So this is actually where it's rounding out and going back behind where that light is. The rump is going to be in shadow here. And then thinking anatomically with this fox, he's going to have a little bit of a shoulder up here that's going to build up. So this section right here where the stomach kind of rounds in to where he's sitting is also going to be in shadow. And then along here, you're going to have a little bit of shading just because he rounds out. And then coming here where his stomach comes up towards his chest, there's going to be some shadow. And then along here on the back side, just because he rounds out, there's some shadow. So there's a lot of little shadow spots that you kind of have to keep in mind as you're coloring, just based on where your light source is. So if you change your light source and you have your light source coming this way, you've still got to keep into account that this head is going to be in the way to have a shadow on the underneath the jaw onto his neck. You're still going to have the shading here. You're still going to have some shading out here because he rounds out, but you're not going to have as much shading here where his body covers that little portion of the tail. You're going to have more shading here. So it's just a matter of keeping in thought where your light source is coming from. And if it makes it easier for you, you can always take your pencil and direct it just like I am to try and think about where the light source is coming from and what's that going to hit as it comes down onto the animal. So let me pull the fox. Now this is from the Thankful Friends stamp set. There is a card that I'm going to show you at the end that goes along with this, and that will be what's on the supply list listed over on my blog after this video is over. So I have a whole handful of pencils here that I'm going to be using. Now I'm using a lot on this one. I'm going to give you other options here as well, but we're going to start out with this 039 pencil. Now this is actually a step up from the pencil that is Pumpkin Bread, which is the ink color again. We're starting out with a pencil that's just a slight step up from the Pumpkin Bread. So we're going to put this down. Again, a very light touch. We're not trying to burnish that paper fiber in at all. And I tend to do little small ovals as I'm coloring. So we're going to start just putting this down on this tail. Now remember, a shadow is not going to create a harsh line where it switches from being up and down to side. So you're going to actually curve that right there. So now I'm laying this down, and the one nice thing about this is because this is so close in color to the ink color that we're using, if you don't get it just exactly where you want, it's not that big of a deal because it does kind of blend in with the image. And especially once you add the additional shading to it, that's going to be just fine the way that it is. So the next step that I'm going to take is I'm going to take this 041. Now this is the darkest brown shade. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to, in a much smaller area, but over the top of where I have just colored, I'm going to go ahead and deepen in the shadow right there along the edge. And again, I am not pressing hard. This is a very light touch with it. So just go ahead and add a little bit more shadow right along those areas. So now I'm going to go in with my 042. Now normally, if you're trying to do photorealistic, I would tell you don't even touch this black pencil. Because this image already has a little bit of kind of a cartoonish type look to it, just in the style and how it's drawn. And because we're using such a smooth cardstock, I'm actually going to go ahead and use this black pencil this time. So very, very light and just right along the very edge, you're going to add just a little bit of this black. And we're not adding very much, just enough to make it pop just a little bit. And then we're going to come back to our 041 and we're going to blend that out. Now because of the wax in this, these blend beautifully. You don't need to add anything else to them to get that blend or that color payoff to it. You just need to put a little bit of time and a very light touch. Okay, and then again, we're going to grab this 039 and we're going to blend this all out even further. Okay. So one thing that I have noticed with it is that using this pumpkin bread, this is a very orangey color, but these browns that I'm using in the colored pencil tend to be a little bit cool toned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this 040 and I'm going to start coloring it over the top of where I put that black and that dark brown, and then just kind of starting into the edge of where that lighter brown is. I'm not going to pull it all the way up to where I did with the lighter brown, but I'm going to go over the top of that darker area. This is going to warm that up a little bit and just bring back that kind of red tone into the image. So that's how I color the red tones in the fox, and I do that all the way through. The white tones, I actually go for a little bit different color palette. I am using 2 grays, and these are actually fairly close to one another, but there is enough of a difference that it helps you with your shading. So I used the 043 and the 044 to do the whiter areas of the fox. So I'm going to very, very lightly with that 043 just lay down a little bit of shadow on here. And then I'm going to come in with this 044 and let me get that pencil out of the way. Deepen this up. Sorry, I'm trying to do this so that I'm not getting a pencil in the way or getting my hands in the way as I color. So it's a little bit of an awkward angle for me. So then here where the curve of the tail is, I'm going to go ahead and lay down a little bit of shading. And then again, I'm going to come back in with that 044 and just add a little bit more and then blend it out a little bit. So I'm going to bring this black back in, and again, very, very light touch with this. I'm going to go right on the edge here. And I'm not going all the way out to where I had the shadow in the first place because I don't want a harsh shadow clear out. I want the shadow to soften as it moves. So then I'm going to grab that 044 and blend that up. And then the 043 and blend that even further. And as long as you're using that soft touch, very light touch, it's going to blend out really well. Now, one thing with animals, in particular with fur and things, most are not a stark white. Stark white is actually kind of the same as black. It doesn't really exist. Things have a little bit of a blue cast or a yellow cast, and particularly with animals, it's a yellow cast. So I'm going to go ahead and take a 017, and what I'm going to do is I am just going to go over this whole white portion of the tail, and I am going to just add a little bit of that yellow tone to it. So just take off some of the harshness of the white. So there's the little tail done. So you go ahead and just repeat that all along the image of the fox. Does that make sense to you guys? And then here is the finished card that I did with the fox image once I got him all colored. So I used the Stay Wild ATS stamp set in Fresh Sage ink, and I stamped it twice before I die cut my circle. This is a circle around die set. And then I just put it over the top of a oatmeal cookie that has been embossed with the barn door or barn wall embossing folder. So that is the finished card. And like I said, this is the card that's going to be on the supply list that's going to be over on my blog. And for those that don't want to spend the time doing a lot of blending, because I know that sometimes that's just a little excessive for your time constraints, this is stamped in, I want to say, cocoa powder image. Now, I took one pencil. This 041 is the only pencil that I actually used. And I just added a little bit of shading to him. So it's just varying the pressure that you use with that pencil to get a little bit and building up that color to get that little bit of shading. So do you see the difference that makes in that little image? It just brings a lot more life into this image. So that's how I do my coloring. If there's any questions at all, just go ahead and put them in the comments. I'm going to flip my camera around and talk to you for just a minute, and then we will be done. Hang on just one moment. Okay, hi. I hope that that made sense to you guys, and I hope that you enjoyed it. You may have to watch certain parts of this video a couple of times just to get everything in your head just right, but it does make a huge, huge difference in your stamped images. You can do the same thing with a line art image. All you have to do is just lay down your lightest color first, and then start building up to your darkest color, and then come back down to your lightest color, just blending everything out. You get a nice smooth gradient as you're working on it. Now, one thing that I didn't mention, and I would like to, is that I spent a lot of time when I was figuring out how to do colored pencil coloring, trying to figure out why my images just didn't pop like some of them that I had seen. And I finally found an artist one day that was talking about it, and she said the number one thing that people forget when they're doing their artwork is that they just don't do, is they don't add enough contrast. So when you go ahead and do your images, and this is really bright, when you do your images, don't be afraid of adding a little bit of dark color there. You're going to be adding it in a very small amount, and you're going to be blending it out. But don't be afraid of the dark colors that are there, because that's what's going to really make your image round out and have that kind of dimensional look to it. So anyway, I am not seeing any questions, so I hope you guys have a fabulous Friday and a wonderful weekend ahead, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye. Much love to you all.